You are listening to the Charles Bonnet Syndrome podcast. My name is Shaimond Foy, and today's special guest is Lucia Ricardo. She is a program lead for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, and I have a special co-host today. Her name is Duchess Antoinette McDonald Ellis, and she is a performing artist and a writer, and she's no stranger to this podcast because she was a guest on episode 2. So how are both of you doing today?
Very good. Thank you, Shaimond.
Oh, that's great. I'm so glad I was able to get you here because you do so many things, Lucia. So can you tell us, explain a little bit about what it is that you do and tell us a little bit about the CNIB, which is the Canadian National Institute for the Blind?
Oh, sure. I'd love to. And first, thank you so much for inviting me to this podcast. I think it's just so amazing that there's going to be an archive of stories and narratives with all different voices around Charles Bonnet Syndrome. So at CNIB, I'm a program lead, which means many things. I generally cover Simcoe Muskoka, which is an office out of Barrie. That's the biggest territory, I guess you could call it. It's a big part of Ontario North. So it's about 50 miles from Toronto, if that helps with a frame of reference. So in that region, we provide programs that range from recreational to peer support to adjusting to sight loss. And also we cover all of Ontario for adjustment to sight loss. So that's one of the areas that I'm focused on. And that's it sort of in a nutshell. And I'll give you a tiny little bit of the history of CNIB, which we started using the acronym exclusively in 2010. You might remember the Halifax explosion. That was a big thing that happened in 1917. And after World War I, there were a lot of soldiers that came home with blindness. And then there was the Halifax explosion where about 600 people or so were left blinded or with having lost their actual eyes. 2 ships collided in the harbor, and it caused a lot of destruction. So a group of men from Halifax or that surrounding area, as I recall, created CNIB. So that's how it started, and from there it's changed over the years. At the beginning, it was for people who had lost total sight. They were housed and had assistance with food and employment, to what we have today, which is, a lot of technology training. We have a come to work program. We have a lot of support groups. And one of our support groups for Charles Bonnet Syndrome is called Seeing Things, which meets once a month.
So how long have you been working for the CNIB?
Yeah, so I've been there 11 years. And when I first started, I knew nothing about Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And one day, the independent living specialist with whom I shared an office was on a little workshop. And she said, "Here, listen to this." And she put it on speaker. And they were talking about Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And I was stunned, as I think most people are when they hear about it, right? So at first you think, how could this be that I've never heard of this? And then it takes really just a few seconds and you think, of course, this makes so much sense, right? So at the time, we had a vice president of research named Dr. Keith Gordon, and he had taken on some research with Canadian subjects who were experiencing Charles Bonnet syndrome and people also from New Zealand. So from Canada, he had over 2,500 people. In New Zealand, 290. And from there, that research in 2014, he concluded that it was between 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 people that were experiencing it. He made some recommendations in terms of having people asked about their experience at every opportunity for when you were having your intake or your assessment when you first came to CNIB. And he had such an interest in it that he's gone on to do a little more research. And one of the pieces that I'm very fond of quoting is his survey of Canadian family physicians to see how many of them were aware of Charles Bonnet. Um, are you familiar with that one?
No, I'm not familiar with
Ah,
that. That is very
okay.
interesting, and it sounds that's important to see. I was going to ask,
Yeah.
what are the results of that? Had he found out how many physicians were aware or weren't aware of it?
Yes, yes, he did. So this was published in Family Practice, Volume 35, Issue 5, in October 2018. And his results showed that of the 495 family physicians across Canada that were surveyed, that answered at least one of the survey questions, 54.7% indicated they were not at all aware of Charles Bonnet syndrome. Right? Yeah, and 19.7 indicated they were slightly aware. I don't know what slightly aware would be, right?
I was thinking the
Right?
same thing. What is? Yeah, yeah. I guess they may vaguely have heard of it once or something, and yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, and about 72% of those physicians, they had patients that would present with visual hallucinations at least once a year or so. So that's a lot of people presenting with visual hallucinations, right? And to see that they're coming to 54% of the time to doctors who don't know what it is was kind of a scary stat.
Yeah, that is kind of scary.
Yeah, because most people go to their physicians for help, and if you are unfamiliar with this condition, how can you help them? And then, of course, you can misdiagnose them or neglect them, or whatever the case may be. So you were at the CNIB. You have been there for 11 years. And you said at some time while you were there, you got introduced to someone, played something for you, and you found out about Charles
Yeah,
Bonnet syndrome. Do you know roughly how long ago that was that you actually found out about the
yeah.
condition?
So that was my second year there. So it was about, well, it was close to 10 years ago. And so at that time, I was so intrigued with it that I part of my portfolio was to hold a summit. And I thought this should be the subject of our summit. So we held a healthcare professional breakfast. That was 2015. And mostly the physicians didn't come, but they sent nurses and PSWs, and that was good. And we had a separate presentation for anyone who had sight loss, caregivers, anyone who was interested. And from there, we started talking about Charles Bonnet in a regular way. And I remember that particular day at intermission, there was a lady who came afterwards and said, you know, I've kept this a secret from my husband for 3 years. This is the first we're hearing about it. And of course, people are always teary because they're finally relieved.
Yes.
Oh, I can definitely speak to that
Yeah.
because, you mentioned that when the survey was done, that most doctors said 72% had patients with this experience, but, very few of them had ever even heard of it. I myself had that exact experience. I did not realize it had to do with my vision loss,
Mm.
right? So I went to my physician and she wrote down what I said and then went on to the next question. So, how's your eating? I'm like, are we not going to address this? And so it shut me down a little bit
Yeah.
because I was afraid of a misdiagnosis or a small, soft room, you know.
Yes.
So yeah, I love the work that you're doing and the fact that you thought, well, let's get talking about this, and we're still talking about this, and I'm happy about it because I believe, you said what it was 1 in 3 to 5 people he believes
Mhm.
he found has it, and
Yes.
I'm wondering if maybe, and I can speak from experience, and fortunately have a very good caregiver who listens to me and believes me when I tell him of the things I see, even before we knew what it was. But I have to say, the experience at the doctor's office, it shut me down a little bit, which did not help the Charles Bonnet.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the things we hear all the time. And part of that particular summit that day, there was one lady who shared her story. She couldn't make it, but she had it all written out. And she had gone to the doctor. The doctor had never heard about it. She said nothing. She was on a vacation with her friend, and she remembered seeing like a little bear in the window and snow on the roof, but they were in Cuba, so she knew there wasn't any snow.
Oh my.
And so, but she was still silent because the doctor had heard nothing. So she had, couldn't verify anything. He had never heard anything about Charles Bonnet. So she happened to come to like a social gathering that we had, which coincided with the day that Dr. Gordon, who's now retired from CNIB, was speaking about the subject as well, because I've had him several times to visit, and she was so enormously relieved. Her friend had told her she was losing her mind, and she was just devastated about that. But when she discovered it was true, she printed something off the internet, took it to the doctor's office. He apologized. The friend apologized. But that's a lot of work to get people to believe you, right? And if she hadn't been there that day, she could have gone years without knowing about it. And that's a scary thing. That's why we put on a fact sheet on our website. There are a lot of awesome websites now for Charles Bonnet syndrome. Ours is just that simple fact sheet that you can print out, take that to your doctor, and it's got a list of resources as well from all the great people that are doing work in Charles Bonnet. Yeah, so that was how it started. And I don't think a day goes by that I don't talk about Charles Bonnet syndrome. And there was one thing that initially just really shocked me, because Dr. Gordon, he was afraid that people could end up in a dementia situation, misdiagnosed. And there was a geriatrician, well, she was doing a geriatric assessment. And I asked her, "Have you heard of Charles Bonnet syndrome?" And she said no. And I was really surprised, because if anyone was going to encounter a lot of elderly people with sight loss, it would be her. And she said, "Oh, here it is on the assessment form. It's under psychosis." And that to me was a sign to keep talking about it, because if it was on an official form that way, we really needed to talk more.
So, what is your website? You said that you have a website with a checklist on it, some information.
On our website, cnib.ca. So all you have to do is type in CNIB and put Charles Bonnet syndrome next to that, and that'll take you to our fact page.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand that you had this. I'm going to call it like a conference or something
Mm-hmm.
of that sort. Initially, as you first found out about it, to try to get some awareness, and you were able to help people that didn't even know what it was and didn't tell their family members. So, what are some other things that you've done or that you do to support to support people that have Charles Bonnet syndrome?
Well, we do have the support group called Seeing Things, and that's open to anyone who wants to participate. Usually, I have one on one with people who call in when they're first searching for some support. It could be anyone from like a social worker. We often get calls from them. Could be an adult child or a family member or a friend, and they just feel something's not right. They've heard their friend talk about these hallucinations, and then they go and do a search and just randomly find the group Seeing Things. And they call, we have a chat. Sometimes all it takes is just one chat with someone, and they feel so relieved they don't need support. Or sometimes they just really do want to talk to others to verify it. Maybe that's part of it, right? Because sometimes it just seems so fantastic that how could it, be real? So they do like to chat with other people, right? And then sometimes they stay and come from month to month to help support their peers, and new people come on every month. So, and it's interesting, some people will experience it in a very frightening way. So we might spend a little more time talking one to one with them. I refer them often to any other resources I can find. I've referred people to Dr. Cusick in the US, and to other websites. And one of the websites, it's a TED Talk that you're probably familiar with Dr. Oliver Sacks. Do you
Yes.
do you ever
Yes.
see that one? Yeah.
That was actually Yeah, that was actually one of the first ones I discovered when first figuring out that I had Charles Bonnet. And I do have to kind of echo what you said. Some, even finding out, okay, this is a real thing and I'm not losing my mind. That in itself was a big, 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 I don't know if I mentioned, but big relief.
Yeah. Yes, it really is. And so with Dr. Oliver Sacks' TED Talk, that's about 18 minutes, right? And he also has the book called Hallucinations, and it has one chapter on Charles Bonnet, but basically everything in that chapter is in that 18-minute segment of that TED Talk. So I find that's just the best thing to send to people right off the bat because it's so easy to understand. He explains just enough of the scientific stuff. I love how he starts. You see with the eyes, but you also see with the brain. And that just puts things in context for everyone. And, I hear also from, for example, there's one story. There was a nurse at a meeting I was at, and I was doing a presentation on Charles Bonnet, and she says, "Well, I have a story about it." So she was working the night shift in a hospital in the Emerge, and she noticed an elderly lady with very thick glasses, and she was being transferred to the psychiatric ward. So she approached the doctor and said, I noticed this about her sight. Have you heard about Charles Bonnet? And her her destination was changed. And so it was like sometimes something so small like that will make such a big difference for people, right? That she happened to notice her glasses and had the courage to go out and say, here, what about this?
Wow. Which is all the more reason why we need to get the doctors also into these meetings and these sessions and these conferences.
Yeah. And a lot of times people say maybe their doctor's great, but no one has sat them down and said, well, this is what Charles Bonnet syndrome is. They may just say, oh, yeah, that's Charles Bonnet syndrome, and just kind of wave you off, right? And that's most disturbing because people leave and they say, well, I couldn't even get like 5 minutes. Like I got this word, this name, but I have no idea what it is. And some people don't have access to the internet. So again, at a loss to understand what they've got.
Has someone picked up the reins of Dr. Keith Gordon since he retired?
I don't believe so. So I've been sort of plugging along and we're still creating awareness, but that hasn't been put up onto any more research that I know of. Although there is some research that CNIB was partnering with. So there's two parts to CNIB. Well, three technically. There's VLRO, which is Vision Loss Rehab, and there's CNIB, which is the charity part, and there's deafblind services as well. But back around sort of maybe the first, close to the second year into the pandemic, we did have a partnership with York University. And at that time, they were doing a study that was with Jennifer Steeves, Dr. Jennifer Steeves. And she was doing some research to find out about the stress levels of people with Charles Bonnet syndrome to see if it had increased their hallucinations. Now, that same or similar study had already been done in the UK, but they undertook that at that time, and CNIB was a small part of that. And since then, Dr. Steeves and her PhD student, Asia Kinnikul, they're doing the study on the non-invasive transcranial magnetic stimulation to help find some way to deal with some of these symptoms, in particular for people who are really struggling, right? Because we know people see their visions nonstop, scary things sometimes, but this is sort of just at the start, and I think it's going to take some time to complete that. So those are sort of that's the main piece that I'm familiar with that's going on north of the US.
So when does your Seeing Things support group meet?
So that's the third Wednesday of the month. We meet from 1 to about 2:30 Eastern Time. It's by Zoom.
And someone can just email you or go to the CNIB website to sign up
Yes.
to get a link.
Yes. I do talk with people first because it is only for people who are experiencing it. If there's family or friends, we have information sessions as well. We set those up maybe quarterly or so when we have enough people to join in.
What would you say if there's someone listening to this podcast and they're having a difficult time with Charles Bonnet? What kind of advice or information would you like to share with them?
That's a good question. So I think the first thing that people come for, at least we do hear this, is that once they discover that they're not alone, it isn't just them, that they feel that enormous relief. So I would say come to the group, listen to the stories. It's not like doom and gloom or anything, it's very supportive. Share your story and see how you feel afterwards. Come back if you feel like you want to talk some more or help support others. And that's what a lot of people do. It can be scary to talk to a group of total strangers, but it's really quite anonymous because we do the meetings dark, so you don't have to be on video. And it's such a variety of people as well, and very nice people. And then once you've got the first meeting under your belt, you realize, hey, yeah, I'm not alone. And that seems to be the main thing that people are looking for, that reassurance from others.
Well, I can speak to from personal experience because, I came to know Shaimond through a similar group that Dr. Cusick hosts every Saturday. And I do have to say, it is, even when I'm not speaking, it is good to hear the other stories and see that there are similarities in some cases. In some cases, I'm really glad I'm not seeing what the other people are seeing. But it's also
Right.
a safe space, and that's really what we need is a safe space where I can talk about whatever's going on this week, as far as the
Yeah,
CBS is
absolutely.
concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. Just that sense of normalcy. That's important too. To hear the stories in a sort of a non-sensationalized way. I think it depends on like how you're talking about Charles Bonnet. Are you communicating it like it is something normal or like something that's not? I've heard people talk about it in various ways, like very animated ways that if you told someone on the street about it, they might look at you and kind of question, is this for real? I guess it depends on your level of acceptance as well. Have you accepted it as a something normal that happens? Can you talk about it in a really cohesive way? You don't have to disclose it to everyone that you meet, right? Some people don't need to know at all.
And the thing is, most people, and the three of us know blind people, but most people don't even know blind people. So, when I can get them to stop yelling at me because I can hear them, even though I can't see them, can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, I can't see
Right.
you, but I can hear you. So even that, to try to explain Charles Bonnet to someone when I'm busy trying to explain to them, it's okay. I'm not that fragile. I am blind. If I need your assistance, I'll
Mm,
ask for it. And I do have slight vision, but I am legally blind.
right. Right.
Now, you had a Charles Bonnet Syndrome Awareness Day in March of 2024, this
Yeah.
past March, and it was dynamite. I was singing, I was joining, and it was so many people there, at least maybe 50 to 70 people or more. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you put it together, and if you're going to have others, like is it going to be, maybe annual or something like that?
Oh, thanks for that question. I was so delighted that so many people came, and Shaman, you were there as well.
I was there
Um,
too.
yes, although I didn't know you at the time. So there were a lot of people there I didn't know, and that was exciting, right? When you actually realize that you're connecting with people that you've never met before. The idea And it's maybe not too different from what you're doing here with this wonderful podcast, was to how can we connect more people around the world? Because there may be parts of the world where they've not heard about Charles Bonnet syndrome at all. And they have no health care. They maybe don't have glasses. They don't have any access to vision care. How must they be suffering? Or maybe there's a taboo they can never tell anyone, and maybe they do truly believe they've lost their minds. Maybe the culture, tells them to never speak of anything that seems like it's related to mental health, although this is not, right? But so I thought, how far can we reach? And we had our wonderful guests from the US and Australia, and Judith Potts, who's been so instrumental of helping our awareness fan out. Judith from the UK, from Esme's Umbrella, with all the research that they're doing there. In fact, it was Judith Potts that first connected me to Dr. Gary Cusick and to Eva Potts, who you've had on your podcast as well. So just the work that she's doing there. So initially, we had tried to gather people together in November, because they do have the UK CBS Day in November. It takes a lot of coordinating, I'm going to say, and understanding of the time zones, which I'm not good with. So Scott Muirden from the Australia Foundation for Charles Bonnet Syndrome, he said, I'll come on super early, very early in my day, but I'll do it. And I so appreciated that. And I think, well, we got a lot of good feedback. People found it good to hear other voices on the topic. And I learned a lot as well. And I hope it would be a yearly one. I kind of thought it would be nice maybe if we took turns, different parts of the country hosting, if that makes any sense. But if it doesn't, I'm willing to do it again.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know that Dr. Gary Cusick would like to do that, or maybe Eva Potts, who's working so hard with Mary Carmel's Light. So yeah, that would definitely be good. You're doing
Yeah.
so much great work. And I found out about you from Eva Potts. She
Mm.
I don't know if she researched, found you. I don't know how she found you, but she found out about you, and she speaks about you very highly. And I looked you up, and eventually was able to email you and was able to find out about this Charles Bonnet Syndrome Awareness Day that you had, because Dr. Gary Cusick shared it. So I just thank you for the things that you're doing to really help people, especially with this condition, or just in general with low vision or blindness. So you're doing a lot of great work. We probably haven't scratched the surface yet. Is there anything that maybe we haven't discussed that you would like to bring up? Because there's so many things, great things that you're doing, or things that the listeners should be aware of.
Well, maybe a tiny bit of something that I'm thinking. And first of all, thank you so much for your kind words. And I feel right back at you because of what you're doing as well. This is awesome. One thing that I think we're really needing to work more on is how to manage the symptoms, because when you're struggling and people say, well, turn the lights off or turn the lights on or distract yourself, that doesn't seem to be working for most people. And so that leads to more frustration. But one of the things I have heard from participants in another group that I lead, which is mindfulness and meditation, growing an awareness around the 7 attitudes of John Kabat-Zinn really has helped people to gain that sort of deeper ability to manage their stress. And if you find that stress is making your symptoms of Charles Bonnet worse, it's something that you can try. Are you familiar with the 7 attitudes of mindfulness-based stress reduction?
I was actually just about to ask you about that, because I am familiar with mindfulness, being fully aware of the moment, breathing into it, but I'm not aware of these 7 levels.
Yeah,
Okay.
you can say I'm not. I know about mindfulness. I know who John Kabat-Zinn is, and about meditation. I actually meditate myself. It's been harder because I've been busy lately, but I definitely do that. But sure, share anything that you would like
Oh,
to
okay.
share about that. And one other thing to piggyback off this second
Yeah.
part to the question: are these mindfulness meetings that you host? Is this open to anybody, or is this just the visually impaired, or if you could speak to that too after you? Uh,
Yeah, sure. It's the current group is for people with sight loss, but what I do hear is from people who have Charles Bonnet syndrome that managing it, it's very helpful when they are familiar with the seven attitudes. So I'll tell you what they are, and you'll probably see how the connections take place. So the first one is non-judging. So, I think when we're constantly judging things, right? And we also judge ourselves. So, someone with Charles Bonnet syndrome might be feeling, you know what, I'm just not good at coping anymore. I'm, there must be some reason why I have this. They could get very negative, right? So, if you check in with yourself, am I judging myself? Am I being negative? Can I be more compassionate to myself? Patience. Patience is the second one, right? If you have Charles Bonnet syndrome and you're seeing it all day and all night when your eyes are open or closed, you want to cultivate patience, right? Beginner's mind. Can you come at this and go, oh my gosh, this is happening again? Okay, can I stay in the moment with it? Yep, I'm just going to look at this. Yes, it's happening again, but I can just let it pass, right? So that's trust yourself. Trust is the next one. Non-striving. You can get so caught up in it. I've got to get rid of these hallucinations. I just don't know what else to do. Don't strive so much. Just let it be. Just be in the moment. Yes, they're there. They're there, but I don't need to get worked up about it. Letting go. Letting go. Sometimes people, I find, create narratives and stories, which can be very, very good, can be very entertaining, but it can also help you to stay in a state of hanging on to the vision. And I think once you're doing that, you may be changing the neural pathways in your brain. You're just really um, keeping them there, forming a deeper relationship with the visions. And if you're trying to get rid of them, that's not going to help you. So sometimes you just want to be able to let go. And acceptance. Acceptance is so big. Yes, this is happening to me. It's out of my control. I didn't cause it. I can't control it. I accept it. And there's gratitude. Not to sound like it's a toxic positivity moment, but I'm grateful that I am still able to do things. It's not, hopefully, not preventing me from, doing some things that I enjoy. And so those are eight. And the ninth is generosity. And that I would see in a form of maybe supporting other people, being on a support group, listening. Listening is very generous, right? Deep listening. So when you're cultivating an awareness of these attitudes, it brings you an ability to have a deeper sense of peace around things. And I think that can then be transferred into how you manage Charles Bonnet syndrome. So I hope I've explained it succinctly enough.
Yes, you explained it very well. And I'm thinking about what you said a little bit earlier. You said that people are told to turn the lights on and turn the lights
Mm-hmm.
off and snap their fingers, and that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
seem to be working. And I don't know if it's just like other conditions or other situations. Something works for a time period and then it stops working,
Right.
or what it is. And I think about this one meeting I was in, a support group, and someone said that she said, how many times am I going to have to snap my fingers and clap my
Mm-hmm.
hands? And I felt so sorry for her, because
Mm-hmm.
you, by human nature, you just want whatever you don't like to stop. But
Yeah.
sometimes it just won't stop. And you have to kind of figure another way to kind of cope with it or deal with it or accept it. One thing that came to my mind, switching gears a little bit, is
Mm-hmm.
I have heard quite a few people say that it's not Charles Bonnet.
Mm.
or they think that it's a spirit, or they think
Mm.
that someone is putting a spell on them or something. Do you have any ways that you can help people deal with that somehow? I don't know if it's a mindset shift or
Mm.
something, because that can make things a little more difficult for someone to deal with it when they
Yeah.
start looking at it that way.
Oh, I'm glad you asked that because it was on my mind. I've heard, I think I'll use the phrase, one person's thought it was a gift, right? And I thought, well, in a way it could be, right? If you can't see anything and you're, in total darkness, and now you're seeing some interesting images, you could see that as a gift. I've had people, and there was one that I think would be concerning. I'll describe it to you. So the image was of a person that maybe looked familiar. And so this lady thought, oh, I think this is a boyfriend that I had back in high school, like 60 years ago, and was able to have the help of her family to track him down and, got reacquainted. And then the conclusion was that it was having Charles Bonnet was like having a premonition. But it's not, right? Because you looked into this image, your imagination kicked in, you thought, yeah, this reminds me of somebody. You set out to make a connection with someone. Charles Bonnet Syndrome did not forecast that you were going to meet someone. This was your own initiative, right? So I think sometimes people can get confused that way. Sometimes they'll say, yes, I know this particular image isn't real, but this other one is. And I don't quite understand that, why there'd be an, a reluctance to recognize that one image over another isn't there. Hmm.
Well, I can just speak again only on a,
Mm-hmm.
from my personal experience, because I am one who has it every day, basically
Mm-hmm.
all day. But I have found that I had to just learn to ask different questions, because at first, when I figured out what it was, I was like, okay, how do we just get rid of it? And then I was like, okay, that's really the wrong question, because the more I've learned about it. So I was like, okay, now how do I deal with it? And I think I said this in my podcast, I have a cherub halo that is pretty much persistent throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I've come to terms with that particular Charles Bonnet vision, because I'm like, now that I understand a little bit more about it as far as physiologically, my visual brain needs something to work on. So I'm like, okay, well, keep the cherubs, because they they don't bother me, they don't disturb me. It keeps my visual vortex working as it feels it needs to, and they're not frightening to me, unlike some of the other visions, or not visions, but other hallucinations that I experience. So yeah, and the thing is, you said something earlier about learning to, you didn't say maintain, what was the word?
Manage.
Manage. Thank you. I knew it was an M word. There we go. Learning to manage it, and that's one of the biggest things I think. Particularly, I'm very interested in the mindfulness and meditation, because I've begun to meditate as well, to
Mm-hmm.
just try to balance out myself and my psyche. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just in life in general,
Oh
it's
yes.
helpful to have, and it certainly isn't something that happens overnight, right? It takes time to cultivate it. And yeah, so one thing that I find interesting, and I don't know if you've also taken note of this, everyone's experience is so unique, but then sometimes there are some pieces that you hear repeatedly, like seeing people in costumes or uniforms,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Like, where's that come? We know it comes from a certain part of the brain, yes, but why do people from all different cultures see people in period costumes or uniforms? And the other one I hear a lot is seeing a little girl crying. That one is intriguing as well.
I too have had the period costume characters. In fact, and it's funny because I did not start drawing until I became legally blind. But I drew it and I actually shared it with the group and they were like, wow, that's amazing. I'm like, no, it's just a pen drawing. But she was so very clear to me. She's a very tall lady. I've never seen her face, but because she always presents walking in front of me. And she's always walking in front of me, but she's in a period long dress with a garden hat. She's got long dark hair and she must be 10 to 12 feet tall. And she always walks in front of me. And again, she never turns to walk towards me, but she always. So I just kind of like, okay, well, she's guiding me. She's because I needed to make sense of her.
Right. And people need that. That's natural, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
And I think responding to what you were talking about earlier and the way people talk about their hallucinations and try to make sense of them, I think that in general it's just human nature to try to make sense of things.
Oh,
And when we don't understand something, we try to understand it, and the mind is just so complex that we really just can't understand it. Our doctors and scientists, they have a good understanding of certain things, but as soon as they figure one thing out, they realize it's something else. And it's so hard to put Charles Bonnet syndrome, just like most other things, inside of a box because it, like you said, it's different for different people. And then, correct me, tell me what your experiences are, Antoinette. But I've heard people say that they keep seeing people that maybe they know from the past, or someone that's deceased, or maybe they see things in colors, and then 2 weeks later they start seeing black and white, and then they'll say, well, black and white is maybe not Charles Bonnet, because colors Charles Bonnet, or someone walks through the floor, but then next thing you know they're floating around, and it's like, and it could be like Dr. Cusick says, when you experience these different things, especially if they're different, write down how you're feeling, write down what you ate that day, write down how much sleep you got, or speak it into your app or something to try to take note of that and try to maybe think of what are some things that are different, or just maybe talk about how you feel, because sometimes it's cathartic just to write down how you feel, or color, like you're saying now, Antoinette. So those are just some things that came to my mind, and I just wanted to bring those up. I don't know if anybody has any insight or additional, things you want to share regarding
Well,
those.
and, as far as what you're saying, Shaimond, I do journal them. I don't necessarily try to assess them always, but particularly if I get, and I say new ones, because like I say, I have this that goes on throughout my day, almost every day. So I'm making note of them, particularly the recurrent ones. I've spoken to you, Shaimond, I know about the dark man, and he's one of the ones that's most frightening to me. And so I've been trying to figure out what his deal is, although he never really approaches me. But unlike the tall girl, he's always coming towards me, whereas she seems to be leading me. But also, one of the things I have found is they change. So yes, sometimes they are in color, sometimes they're black and white, sometimes I get a brick wall, sometimes I get a stone wall. So it's the gift that keeps on giving.
Let me ask you this, Antoinette. Is there like a go-to coping mechanism that always works, or that works like 95% of the time? Or is it maybe if you're having a stressful day, even that coping mechanism won't work?
Well, the first thing, and I think I talked about this on the podcast that I did with you earlier, the first thing I do is I do my checklist. Can I see it full screen? If the answer is yes, well, that right away I know that that's Charles Bonnet because my world is not full screen. So then, is this one that is frightening me? Because I told you about the dancing trees. I don't know if I shared that on the podcast, but the trees in my dog park dance with me. Right. And if it is one that frightens me, then I say to myself, that dancing tree cannot hurt you. Now, what's interesting about that, it does help me to cope. It doesn't always help them to go away, but I always have a visceral reaction. Like the cherubs, they bring me joy, so that keeps me in kind of a good mood. The dark men, the dancing trees, frighten me. So even though I'm dealing with it, I'm coping with it, I recognize it as a Charles Bonnet episode. I do know that I can feel my heart start to flutter. My breathing becomes different. So then in that case, I always say, okay, breathe deeply, because what you don't want to do is pass out in the dog park. because you hyperventilate. So I do deep breathing, and then I will close my eyes, and I'll count to 5. And often then, in those cases, they will go away.
Mm.
So,
Wow. So that's just a mental checklist that you just developed over time.
yep.
Okay. I
Good.
wanted to ask you, Lucia, first of all,
Mhm.
I wanted to say thank you for not just focusing on people that have Charles Bonnet syndrome, even though that's first and foremost the most important thing because they are the ones with the condition. So thank
Mhm.
you for doing that, but not just solely focusing on that, but reaching out to people that are researching, making people aware of things, spreading the word, having these events. But also, what I wanted to say is thank you for doing things and having these meetings for people that are caregivers because you said that you have those.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, that's so important. And how can somebody join those caregivers Zoom meetings that you have?
So once I have enough people, we can set one up, or we just wait and do them. I think I mentioned quarterly, but sometimes we might have to spread it out a little bit because just in the interest of my schedule. So if anyone wants to connect and they're a caregiver that's struggling, I just need 4 or 5 people to put together a group that wants to talk together. So just connect with me, send me an email, and we can
Okay.
make stuff happen. Yeah.
And I'm gonna put your, if it's okay with you, I'll put your email in the show notes in case anybody sees this
Sure.
episode and listens to it.
Yeah.
Can you verbally say it? Because some of the guests, some of the people that listen to the podcast say they have a hard time maneuvering the show notes and they would rather
Sure,
hear it verbally.
sure. So it's just lucia.ricardo@cnib.ca. So lucia.ricardo@cnib.ca.
Okay.
So,
And I want to kind of piggyback off what I was just saying or continue on with the caregivers for a moment.
mhm,
As you know, being a caregiver for anyone is challenging, but someone with Charles Bonnet can be have even more challenges in certain ways.
mhm,
So, what kind of advice would you give to someone that's a caregiver and they're struggling to be able to cope with helping their
mm.
loved one and even helping themselves, along this journey of
Okay.
caregiver?
Yeah. I'll sort of refer to an example from a call I had last week. So, an elderly lady was really struggling with her hallucinations, and the daughter was feeling really bad because there was nothing that she could do. And so we spoke at length. And I think one of the main things is when we tell people, oh, just, create a distraction for yourself. So they try that. But creating a distraction doesn't seem to work all the time. And so I think there's another part to that. Once you create the distraction, you need to focus on something else. But you need to focus on a way that your mind is really focused on something else. So it could be something as simple as start listening to a good book on CD, or if you download your books or whatever, but come away from your environment and allow yourself to get engrossed in that audio book, or go for a walk. We've talked about that before. It's unless you're going with someone. If you're in the midst of having hallucinations, you probably don't want to go for a walk, right? Especially by yourself if you have sight loss. So you need someone there with you, right? So cultivate some friends that know what you're going through. Have a conversation with them. You don't have to talk about your Charles Bonnet all the time, just so that you have an ability to refocus in a deeper way, because there are people who have this all day long, but they manage to have rich full lives or have a job. That's because they tune it out. They have found a way to tune it out by focusing on something else. So stay in support of your loved one. Don't say things like, oh, it's just your imagination. Hear out the description of what they're saying, but don't keep people talking like all day. And who do you think it might be? And things like that. Because if it's not someone recognizable, and often it's not, you might just want to let that go. Because if you start talking about it more, that's going to be your focus, right? The thing you focus on persists, right?
So I'm gonna have an episode. I've been talking about this episode for a long time, so I better hurry up and record it. Where I'm gonna share information from experts and from people that had Charles Bonnet syndrome, and it's gonna be the coping mechanisms.
Mm.
But can you share maybe one or two coping mechanisms that you've heard people say or discuss that have helped them?
Well, through the mindfulness based approach, connecting to your breath, come into the moment, because your mind can start racing when you see the hallucinations. You can start making up narratives for them. You can start worrying. Some people might have anxiety. Come back to your breath, unless you've had some past trauma. So I don't want to say this works for everyone, but connect and stay in the moment. Just listen to yourself breathe. Notice the breath through your nostrils, nice and cool, and notice it coming out on your exhale, nice and warm. Connect and stay in the moment. Don't let yourself race away with it. Don't let your mind get away. Your imagination or your hallucination take you away. So try and stay in the moment.
Thank you for sharing that.
Mm.
Yeah. And Antoinette, what is something that you do? Because I hear quite a few people that have Charles Bonnet syndrome say that they know that the hallucinations are not real. They know that they have Charles Bonnet syndrome, but when they wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and they see somebody hovering over them or they see something frightening, it just in the moment they lose all of that. And I'm not trying to be insensitive, but I'm just saying, like, what would you say? Because I don't want to sound insensitive, and you actually have Charles Bonnet syndrome. Do you have anything to say about that, or does that happen to you in the moment, or have you learned how to deal with that a little bit better?
That happens to me. And like I said earlier, some of them will give me like a start. So my heart will start beating faster. I can feel it. My breath will get faster. So I do then begin to focus on my breath. I close my eyes. I go through my checklist, right? Um, Also, I have a dog, and if Thaddeus is my dog, if Thaddeus doesn't react, I recognize, okay, this is Charles Bonnet syndrome. Because at night when I get up, because I've reached an age where now I must do that in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, there's always a man sitting in the chair in my bathroom.
Mm.
So when that happens, I just ignore him because now he's going to be there. So I figure I don't give him energy. You know, so I mean, it's difficult because yes, in the moment, particularly when a new one starts, in the moment, it's difficult. But I do the first thing I do is my checklist. Yeah, and then I say to myself, now you have created this. And also something I learned in the group was we also can create weapons, right? Just like I created the scary image, my finger can be a scary image. My finger can be a gun, it can be a ray gun, it can be a bow and arrow, it can be whatever I need it to be to get rid of this thing that's frightening me.
Thank you for sharing that.
Mm.
Well, I think it's always good to hear people that actually have Charles Bonnet syndrome talk about how they cope and how they experience things. And I know it's different for different people, but I think it's so important to hear that. And I try to say that people with Charles Bonnet syndrome are my heroes because it's not easy, and they keep going. You keep going, show up to the meetings, you may be frightened, it may be difficult, but you continue going, and that goes for you, Antoinette, and the many
Mm.
others that I hear, because it is definitely a frightening thing. As I talk to people about it, and they just say, "Wow, that's tough." Obviously it's anonymous. I just talk in general what Charles Bonnet syndrome is. They say, "Man, that must be tough." You know?
Mm.
And I do have to say thank you, Lucia, because what you are doing, you don't even realize how much you're helping people.
Mm.
Because the information, they can call you, they can get to resources. That is just, it is, I think the best resource right now is getting information to people, particularly, with Charles Bonnet and the medical professionals, there we go, who deal with people with vision loss and blindness.
Thank you, Antoinette. But what I see is so amazing too is how people are helping each other, that peer support.
Oh,
There's
yes.
nothing like that, right? But if I could go back for a second to something you said about how you journal your experiences,
Yes.
I would like to encourage people to do that. If it's maybe, an audio file they keep, or if they're able to write it down, I think there's a lot more we could learn from people's journals on CBS that I don't think we've harnessed anywhere, these stories. What was happening at the time? Where were you? What was your state of mind when it was happening? What did you see under this sort of circumstance? Just the frequency with which you see something. I think we still could learn a lot from that. I don't think anyone's done a study on that. I'd like to see people keeping track and see if they notice any difference as well.
I think that would be an exciting study.
Mm.
And also something you mentioned earlier, there are similarities like the period costumes, like the small children. And I do wonder what that's about. I've never lived in a time where people wear long dresses with flowered hats, other than, at a fair or something. So I do think that would be, and I hope someone listening perhaps has the time and the ability to go ahead and start this type of research, because the stories of each of us, and even sitting in the groups hearing other people's stories, whether it's similar to mine or not, is useful, it's helpful. And even to tell your story, because I know a couple of weeks ago I was in CBS craze because they were coming at me like literally from everywhere, and I was losing it, even though I knew what it was and I had the skills. But it's exhausting. And being able to share that with people that I don't have to first explain, well, this is what's going on.
Right.
This is Charles Bonnet. So that group, the peer-to-peer back and forth, the support groups, that is just very beneficial. Very beneficial.
And Antoinette, may I ask you too, and maybe Shaimond also, because you were a caregiver for someone with CBS. How did you deal with the not knowing? How long is this going to go on? Is it? We used to say 18 months, but more and more, right? People have it, yeah, right? It's decades. We're hearing so many people who've had it for decades.
Well,
That not knowing,
I have had it for at least 15 years that I can speak of, and I just found out about it within this past calendar year. So, and the thing is, I just thought, well, okay, there goes another vision, all right. But and I'll disclose, I have glaucoma, and so my vision is progressively getting worse and worse. And as it gets worse, the Charles Bonnet is more and more. And it had finally gotten to the point where I was not dealing well with it at all, in answer to your question, because I really thought, okay, I'd come to terms, and I've said this over and over, I've come to terms with the vision loss. But what I cannot come to terms with is the fact that I thought I was losing my mind, because I was like, that's the one thing I still got going.
right?
But the information, like I said, the initial information was probably the biggest gift of all of this, was I was like, okay, I'm not cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. And now I need to learn skills to deal with this. I need to learn tools. I need to have these groups of people that I can talk to about this. So I didn't do well with it at all, and especially when it became a lot. So,
Yeah.
and I'm just thankful for my caregiver, my husband, because he is one who never said to me, "Oh, you're crazy. Oh, it's all in your head." He would say, "Well, what do you see? What are you looking at?" And I would tell him, he'd say, "Okay." And he would always say this, "Okay, well, I don't see that, but I believe you do." And even that was a gift, because I was like, okay, he at least believes what I'm saying to him.
Right.
And Antoinette,
Yes.
you said 15 years you've had it?
At least, yeah.
Wow, I didn't even know that, or if I did, I forgot that. That is just,
You
it's
probably
amazing.
didn't know that.
Yeah, because there was information out there. I talked, and Judith Potts said this in an interview that I had with her. She said that I believe it was the World Health Organization. They recognize it now, and it has some, some recognition, but it's still kind of misclassified because they say it goes away in like 18 months. And
Mm.
we know that that's not the case. For some people,
Mhm.
it could be, but for the majority, that's not the case. And that is a long time to deal with it. And I know you have your moments, but you're not letting it steal your life and steal your joy. And
Mhm.
it's good to have a moment, but not like let it be a lifetime or let it be, just change everything. So that is wow. Well, I can't wait to listen to or watch. Yeah, that's a better word. Watch your play
Mm.
when it's out, because your play actually has a lead character that has Charles Bonnet syndrome in it, right? Because you're a playwright also.
Absolutely.
Wow, okay.
Awesome.
Yeah. That's it's more and ways to get things out there. It's so important.
Just on that same topic, a while back, maybe 4 years ago, there was a filmmaker who was working on a documentary in the UK, and we sort of lost track of him. Since then, Judith has up on her Facebook a different documentary that a Spectrum, I think it's called, but also they included it in some of their mainstream programming that people are, that's popular, like a character in Doc Martin had Charles Bonnet syndrome, if you ever watched that series.
I have
It's a pretty,
watched that series.
yeah, it's a
Okay.
September 2021, I think, is when that one aired. And so it's an older fellow and he's not being himself, and his wife has recently died and he thinks he's seeing her, and then they discover, yes, his eyesight has been declining, and Doc Martin diagnoses Charles Bonnet syndrome.
Wow.
Yeah.
Does he say Charles Bonnet syndrome?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I
And
don't mean to get so excited.
it's good. It's good, right? And so the other one, they first got it in because Judith herself also had been an actress, and so I don't know if she had any connections, but on Coronation Street, also very popular. It's like a serial, kind of like a soap opera, and it runs here in Canada too. They gave a character Charles Bonnet syndrome in conjunction with, I think it was multiple sclerosis, and he was incarcerated unfairly, unjustly, and he was seeing his son. He thought it was his son who was, had passed, but he didn't want to take medication because he didn't want to lose these images that he was seeing. So that was pretty groundbreaking when you have these portrayals, right? In shows that an entire country's watching. So here in Canada, I learned from someone who was involved in some way that they were filming, and as the filming has just been happening this month in Toronto, filming a new series called Dr. Wolf about the life and work of Dr. Oliver Sacks.
Nice.
Right?
Sounds great.
So I put in a plug. I said, is there a possibility to find out if Charles Bonnet syndrome could be included here? Because if you're going to research Dr. Oliver Sacks, you have to see that 18-minute video on CBS. So I'm really hoping that could happen. That would go a long way.
Oh, absolutely.
That is
That's
really
exciting.
amazing. Yeah, it really is. Something that you said earlier, Lucia, that is just sticking in my mind. I don't really know how to really phrase the question, but it's on my mind, so I'll try my best. You pretty much said that, I feel like I'm paraphrasing it, but you said that in a sense, we are our own community. Like you don't have to. You said someone with CBS doesn't have to tell everybody, but
Mhm.
if you're in a support group, you should have that special bond with someone. You should be able to feel like you're able to communicate with them. And I just think about whether it's African Americans, whether it's Indians, whether
Mm.
it's whatever it is, like when you have a certain group of people or anything or whatever it is that they're dealing with and they don't find the support or whatever else they need, they find a way amongst themselves to try to support each other. And we're like stronger than we realize, like because we have you're in Canada, we have me, I'm in New York,
Mm.
Antoinette's in Texas, and
Mm.
and we have like Scott Muirden in Australia and Judith Potts in the UK. And it's not really necessarily where you're at, but it shows that it's a global
Mhm.
movement. And
Yeah.
and this is like really a family, really. Even though we don't speak every day, we stay in touch and share information. And now things like this podcast and things
Mm.
like your information session, I'm going to call it.
Mhm.
You can really find ways to we can really find ways to try to help each other out as best as possible and utilize all of these talents and the passion and all the things together. So I don't know if I did a good job of saying that, but it really was so
Yeah.
important. What I got out of what you said by somehow having our own community is what I
Yeah,
got
no,
out.
that was a great summary. And unfortunately, I think some cultures may be more afraid than others to talk about it, right? But if you can talk to a spouse or a friend, don't be afraid to do that because there's lots of information to back you up, right? You can go on cnib.ca, print a simple fact sheet. It's got just the facts, just not a lot of them, just one page worth. You can find proof that what's happening to you is real. You really are seeing these things. You've not lost your mind. Yeah.
One thing that we're trying to do here in the States, and really Eva Potts is leading this, but and Judith Potts is trying to do this in the UK, is to somehow put literature into the doctor's offices, especially of
Mhm.
ophthalmologists, because often when people have a severe eye condition, they have a higher chance of developing Charles Bonnet syndrome. And the only reason I'm wording it that way is because I just talked recently in a podcast with a doctor, and they were saying sometimes it's not even really severe. It's just a visual impairment in general. But are you have has there been any progress as far as getting literature put into ophthalmologist offices? I know you briefly discussed that earlier, like what the other doctor was trying to do with studies and information.
Well,
Have you
that
been?
was one of our initial go tos, right? It kind of seems like the low hanging fruit. Let's get some pamphlets out there. And at one point, I did have some funding from a pharmaceutical company, and we did print out some Charles Bonnet trifolds. Actually, they were actually more like little booklets, and because there were a few pages in there, and but we ran out, right? So we ran out. So I think even if it's just a page in proper font, in large print, and saying, to people, can you print a few of these out and see if your eye doctor's office will take them? That was my initial hope for that we could do that. I think that could go a long way. If we can't afford pamphlets, maybe even the optometrist's office wouldn't mind printing a few for their wait room or have them available for people who get diagnosed on the spot. So it's just about having that conversation with your eye doctor, going in with a few copies and saying, "Hey, look what I've got. Do you want to share these?" I think it could be a start.
Yeah, and I like the fact that you have a one sheeter on your
Mhm.
website because if someone is going to the doctors and they are experiencing some of these symptoms of Charles Bonnet syndrome, they can actually give that to the doctor and they can say, "Oh wow, okay, all right," and then they can do a quick Google search if they are diligent and they can say this is a legitimate condition that's recognized because that can actually help to be able to have. Because I printed something from SV's Umbrella's website and
Mhm.
took it, to show, and that was very helpful.
Yes, because my understanding from talking with physicians is that they like their information nice and succinct. They don't want to have to go searching through 20 pages. If they want to know more, they know how to get more information. So just the facts, just the brief facts.
Well, is there anything that you would like to say in closing? Anything at all, even if it's unrelated to Charles Bonnet syndrome?
Mm. Just that I'm going to be looking out for that series on NBC called Dr. Wolf, just with my fingers crossed, and just thankful to have been invited today and for the work that both of you are doing and getting the word out. And I really appreciate that you included me in your podcast. So thank you, Shaimond and Antoinette. Great to meet you.
Great to meet you. Thank you so
Mhm.
much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for what you're doing, and we just appreciate it, and it's definitely noticed, and it's definitely making a difference. And I'm just grateful for you being here and sharing your story. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Could I share this tiny little poem that it was Judith Potts in the UK that alerted me to? It's very short, and
Sure.
maybe you've heard it before. And it was initially called Antigonish, and it was written in 1899 by an American educator and poet, William Hughes Mearns. And then it got changed to The Little Man Who Wasn't There. So it's yesterday upon the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. When I came home last night at 3, the man was waiting there for me. But when I looked around the hall, I couldn't see him there at all. Go away, go away. Don't you come back anymore. Go away, and please don't slam the door. Last night I saw upon the stair a little man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. Oh, how I wish he'd go away.
Mm.
And that when Judith told me about that poem, and it's a Canadian poem from Nova Scotia, but I think it really kind of captures that mystery of it, the frustration of it, and it's in the public domain, so I thought it'd be okay to read it on out today.
Yeah. Well, thanks for reading that. It's so powerful. Art
Yes.
is so powerful, and there's so many different ways. I was talking to someone. I'm not trying to prolong the podcast, but I was
Mm,
talking to someone named Gareth Brooks, who's that's actually the next episode that I'm going to release. And we're just saying he's a graphic artist, and he wrote a graphic novel. And I was just saying that who knows, art may be the thing that helps get Charles Bonnet Syndrome in the forefront, or helps find a way to cope with it, or it can be more important than people know, because everybody's looking at the science, which is very important, but there may be other ways that people can express themselves and spread awareness, or even find a really relief somehow, some way.
yeah, absolutely. And we've had artists who use their Charles Bonnet syndrome in their work as well.
Wow.
Well, like I
Yeah.
said, I didn't start drawing until
Right.
until I went legally blind. So,
Right. Right.
Isn't that something? Yeah. In life, no matter if you believe in God or not or whatever, life always, if you live long enough, it kind of somehow, some way works out for your good in the long run. Whether it's inspiring someone else, or whether you said you don't realize that at the time, but when you look back, oh, if this didn't happen to me, that wouldn't have happened to me. You don't realize it in the moment. And truthfully, everybody's going to go through something in some, shape or
Mm,
form or fashion, and we don't know, but we don't know why certain people have this condition or other conditions, but we will keep spreading the word, keep being patient, keep spreading love. And thank you, Lucia, for doing what you do as far as letting people have a platform to talk about things, and what you're doing, Antoinette, because you actually are starting to be what I'm considering an ambassador, and you reach out to
mm,
multiple people directly, and you can get more intimate when you reach out to someone one on one and build a
mm.
bond in a different way than you can do in a corporate setting. So I appreciate what you do with that, and even taking the time to be on this podcast. Some people or maybe not, won't step up, or maybe not as organized, and you really took your time and you put your effort in, and I just I'm just grateful, so thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. This has been a lovely experience. Thank you both so much.